Okay, top commenters. This is a different kind of episode today because we are speaking to you live from, not exactly live because this is pre-recorded, but we are speaking live to an audience at Crosswires in Sheffield, Podcast Festival. And Matt is not here, but I am joined by a special guest, Rachel Connolly.
Hi, really nice to be here today. I am a journalist and a cultural commentator, and I write a lot about internet trends and so forth. So excited to chat today.
Unlike Matt Shea, we don't believe Rachel is a believer, but nonetheless, we can continue on. We're going to be talking about loads of different stuff today, Rachel. Particularly this loneliness influences trend that you have written about.
Yes.
Which we hope everyone here is ready for some solo maxing and discussing all sorts of terms that we're going to get into and define. We're also going to be talking about heteropessimism.
Yes.
Which feels like a bit of a hard word to say, and also the femosphere and femcells. So we're going to take you on a bit of a journey through social media land and the kind of inner workings of your algorithms and feeds. And without further ado, let's get cracking. Let's start by defining sort of solo maxing. What is it?
Yeah, so I think there's a kind of new trend, a relatively new trend, / it's being called a new trend for these influencers who really advertise the fact that they spend a lot of their social time alone. So they come home from work, they don't have friends, as they say, they make dinner by themselves, they kind of rewatch a TV show, they do sort of like a lot of like cozy activities and then bed. And part of what they're promoting is like this kind of lifestyle, which is like very divorced from other people. And
it's interesting because in some ways they're posting as though they're alone, but then a lot of their interactions are, well, a lot of they're getting their reward, so to speak, through the interactions they have with their followers, right? So it's almost like showing that you're lonely in order to then interact with the world, but through this different kind of interface.
It's a very strange lifestyle because theoretically you would always be alone, but never really by yourself because you're always making content and putting it out to be viewed by other people. And I think that's something that's quite interesting about this content too, because there's a lot of benefits to spending time by yourself, you know, like reading an interesting book, learning a language, but none of this is really promoting doing anything that's particularly like enriching. So it's not kind of like about developing yourself or even challenging yourself or anything like that. It's very much like retreating into like comfort. So that's quite like an interesting bit of it, I think.
And this solo maxing concept seems to have started with quite a few Gen Z influencers basically saying it's so expensive now to go out for dinner or go to the cinema or whatever it is that you fancy doing, that it's better to kind of spend time alone doing these sorts of activities. But actually, it seems like some of the influencers, I mean, I was having a bit of a scroll beforehand and I read the piece that you'd written, and it seems like so many of these influencers are people who are not doing it from a kind of economic viewpoint now, but rather as a sort of persona online, or actually just being able to be like, I don't really want to talk to people.
Yeah, well, that's the interesting thing about anything that becomes a popular persona online is that you basically have to think of a USP to make yourself stand out, and influencers are all trying to do that. And just there is a kind of bent, I think, in the online space because we see so much content, you have to do something slightly freakish, I think, to attract attention to yourself. And so I think a lot of this kind of like, oh, wait, nobody's made content about not having friends before. That's a taboo subject. So like, that's my content now. I don't have friends. Or like, yeah, as you say, like this, something that starts like solo maxing, it starts as like okay, it's so expensive to go out and entertain all the time. And like, so like, you know, let's kind of do something, a revolt against that. But I think it sort of starts as a way to attract attention for yourself, and then someone kind of really beds into the identity because it's like how they've attracted followers and how they've attracted attention.
And I guess some of this also seems to be born from the way that social media works, because unlike sort of pre-social media, I guess, you can grow a huge community, or even quite a niche community, but nonetheless committed community of people without having to actually talk to anyone. And it's that phenomena of, I guess, meeting someone who's super chatty online and then you meet them in person and they kind of don't really say very much. And you're like, oh, well, hang on a second. You don't quite seem like the person you've represented online.
It's super interesting. And like I wrote about this when I was writing about the loneliness influencers. What really struck me about this trend of loneliness influencers is that to me, it doesn't feel like that much of a new trend because influencers have always been, you don't really see much of their life. Like you don't see, some of them hide their boyfriends, you don't see a network of friends. You might see one or two other people, but you don't see like a network. And to make that much content where you're on your own, you actually do have to spend a lot of time on your own. But having said that, it's like, it's a sort of weird thing because it's like, if you think about the kind of person who would want to spend a lot of time on their own making stuff to be viewed by other people but not interacting with other people, it's quite a specific way to live. And I think it's a sort of like fantasy life, I guess, where you can control your social interactions from like your bedroom. So it's like, it's probably not somebody who has ever found normal social environments particularly easy, because if you did, then why would you want to do that?
Yeah, and it's that kind of the way that I think that social media is reshaping how people interact and what they're rewarded for posting and sharing. We were joking about this before. I would be terrible at solo maxing, particularly bad. I'm very bad at anything solo. But I think that, or rather, like being around people and like talking too much, hence my job. But I think that, one of the things that struck me about this as well is the idea of you don't need to have anyone in your life. And that connects to this concept of sort of heteropessimism, right? That you don't actually, it's not worth being in a relationship anymore. How do we define that heteropessimism?
Yes. Heteropessimism is a term that is like very discursive for the past couple of years. I think it gets used in a lot of different ways. So I think the way that I understand it, so I think there's some of the sort of like arguing points of heteropessimism that I think everybody would agree with. But then sort of some of the corollaries I think are like a bit more dubious. So I think heteropessimism kind of, it's young women mostly, and they kind of argue that, you know, we live in a very patriarchal culture, which I would agree with. I think most people would. And I think even in the manosphere, they would agree with that. But then heteropessimism sort of says like...
Let's dial up Andrew Tate. What do you think about heteropessimism, Andrew?
Heteropessimism would sort of say like, okay, well, because we live in this very patriarchal culture, heterosexual relationships reflect the worst of that culture, and they're sort of doomed to only reflect the worst of that culture. And so heteropessimism kind of argues we just stay in these relationships, there's no hope for kind of better relationships, and we basically just complain about men all the time. And that's what I understand it to mean. And I guess, I mean, I agree that we live in a very patriarchal culture, but I think, as I understand it, like it affects every relationship we have, not just our like romantic and sexual relationships. And I kind of worry with this discourse that it has warped the conversation about sort of patriarchy around to be just a conversation about sexual and romantic relationships. Whereas, as I would see it, you actually have more choice with those relationships than you do. So, you know, like even if you vow to never date any man, like you will work with men. And so like, you know...
Our producer sits quietly aside a man.
And, you know, heteropessimism, I think, can sometimes be really reductive too in terms of like our friendships and family relationships. So like the reality of living in a patriarchy is that all of our friendships, even our female relationships, they're all affected by this. And yeah, I guess to me it's like boiled that whole wider sort of historical truth down into like men are the problem and relationships with men is the problem.
It's something that's been popping up quite a lot on my social media feed recently because it's the latest series of Love Island, which some of you may or may not be watching. And there's quite a lot of discourse online about the attitudes of the women and men in the villa towards one another. I mean, it's always a topic of conversation, every series of Love Island, and people will analyse their relationships and what's healthy and what's toxic and what's not okay. But this year in particular, there have been several of the women on the show who've been pretty sort of vocal about what they think about men and how they feel about the way men treat women, and then there's been both praise and criticism for that. And I've seen quite a few people mentioning this kind of pink-pilled ideology, so this idea that people have been pink-pilled rather than red-pilled. So I guess that's defining this femosphere in relation to the manosphere, which for those of you sitting here and people listening, I'm sure know to be, you know, this world where basically men are very derogatory about women. The role they see women play in their lives is pretty transactional. And in some ways, the femosphere feels like the kind of yin and yang of that. But actually, is probably not reactive to the manosphere.
Yeah, I think the idea of like heteropessimism or whatever, I think it is speaking to the fact that for all of history, basically, we've lived in a very patriarchal culture and society, and that's been true basically everywhere. So that's not a new thing, but I think that, and I guess it's interesting because in the manosphere, I don't like when I listen to Joe Rogan, they don't dispute that fact. They would just argue that that's a reality of the way that men and women are. So they would say like, oh, well, men are mostly in leadership positions, but that's because men are leaders and women aren't naturally. So they're not disputing the reality. They're just disputing like whether or not that suits people. But I guess some of the kind of like on the femosphere side of it, sometimes to me, it doesn't feel like it's disputing. Like it feels like it's making the similar kind of arguments. Like there's a very sort of like men are from Mars, women are from Venus. And I actually think like we share so many more qualities than we have distinct. So it's kind of, yeah, it's a sort of strange argument, I think.
And I think when you talk about the femosphere, I mean, what I consider it to be is in lots of ways it has parallels with the manosphere in terms of who populates it. So there will be lots of influencers who very specifically build their content up talking about men. Sometimes they'll be talking about feeling pessimistic about relationships and so on, but they take it that step further. And you can see how, a trend like anyone who uses TikTok might have come across the trend, women in male fields with like women joking about doing the kinds of things that men do in relationships that aren't great. And you can see how that then becomes a bit of a pipeline towards slightly more extreme ideas that are essentially saying that women get everything right and men don't, and aren't actually talking about gender equality, but kind of taking it that step further. And you've got podcasters as well. There's a kind of irony that the 1 week that we have got a female co-host, we're now two women talking on a podcast about the femosphere.
It's a sort of weird thing, I think, because it is obviously a truth, and every sensible person would agree with this, that there's an epidemic of like violence and sexual violence perpetrated by men, not all men by any stretch of the imagination, but that's obviously not being perpetrated by women. So it's like, it's obviously wrong and false to kind of like collate the two things as like equal. But I think that something that is destructive in the sort of femosphere side of things is that I think this kind of like divisive language fuels the rhetoric in the manosphere. So I think in the manosphere, they kind of point to some of the rhetoric that is used, and that's on the other side, and say, well, like, look the way they speak about us men hating feminists and whatever. And I think that kind of divisiveness has a trend that we've seen for the past like 10 or 15 years about all manner of topics, and it never really leads to a positive place. So it's like you cannot argue with someone, you generally cannot argue in a really angry way with someone to get them to agree with you. It doesn't really work like that. You sort of preach to the converted and then make them more extreme. And so, yeah, I kind of wonder about the utility of it, I guess, and what it's actually doing. And on the femcell side, it's like people would maybe argue like, oh, well, it's harmless because, it's not coming from a place of like, it's definitely not as harmful as the manosphere, but I don't think it's actually having any positive impact at the same time.
And then in this kind of same ecosystem, you've got the trad wives phenomenon, which is influencers, women that will present themselves as very kind of conservative wife type figures who like they seem to be making butter, raising 1,000 children, and also like keeping 7 pet chickens all in the same hour. And a lot of that content will be very aspirational. Like it will show a beautiful house and a beautiful garden and a beautiful family. I mean, a lot of it's very US heavy, but actually there are influencers in the UK who do this too. That feels like the sort of, in some ways, that feels like the yin and yang of the femosphere. You've kind of got the people who...
The interesting thing about the trad wife thing is that like they're all businesswomen. So they all have these, a successful trad wife influencer has a huge empire.
Which they run and benefit from.
So they're actually the CEO of a company. So they kind of are doing almost the opposite of being, staying at home. And I guess part of why women historically, that again, if you listen to Joe Rogan, a lot of the time when they have female guests on, which is not that often, the women who they have on tend to argue, well, like I prefer to be a homemaker and that's how I get validation or whatever. But historically, obviously that changed because a lot of women didn't feel like that's what they wanted to do and whatever. And trad wives are not doing that. Like they are being a mother and they're having children, but they're also a businesswoman and they're getting a huge amount of validation from the outside world. So it's kind of like a lot of things online where it's like, the lifestyle that they're selling is not the one they're living. Like the lifestyle that they're selling, which is that, yeah, you're a mother to 10 children and that's where you get all of your, that's not what they're actually doing. And there's like that's a very big distinction, which is interesting.
Yeah, and you notice that a lot of this content is so aspirational, and it's essentially, and I think when we talk about this and we talk about the impact of it, whether it's this femosphere or whether it's the trad wives phenomenon, um, the thing that matters really is the impact on users, which is particularly when an influencer is advocating for a point of view or a lifestyle that is not the one that they are authentically living. So say someone who's like, hate all men, get rid of them, and then they go to bed and they're lying next to their boyfriend and they're like, good night. Or the trad wife who is saying, oh, look, my 10 children and all my chickens, and then, they go out and do Pilates and someone else comes and looks after their kids. It's like you're not seeing any of that behind the scenes, but actually there will be people who believe, because influencers are built around this kind of individualistic authenticity, that is true and real and that they can aspire to it, when actually what's being sold to them is essentially just not true at all.
And I think about that with
not the case for everyone, but for some.
But with the heteropessimism sort of world, when it comes to relationships, I believe everyone should do what they want, but what they actually want. So like I believe that like if a woman wants to be single and finds that enriching, like for sure. But if what you actually want is a relationship, you will make that more difficult for yourself if you're like posting angrily about men and how terrible men are. Like any man would see that and be like, oh no. So it's like, it's a kind of weird thing, because it's like the person who has at the top of the heteropessimism like pyramid scheme, I guess, who has like built their identity and brand by sort of like promoting that type of content and like, like sort of that's what they say and they, get a book deal out of it or whatever. That's a person who's like materially benefiting from like that, being their brand. Whereas the person at the bottom of the pyramid who's just sort of like angrily posting, they're not materially benefiting in the same way. And so it's like, and if that's what they want, then like great. But if it's not, then yeah.
Yeah, and in lots of ways, it's the same as how many of these different online communities work, which is where you will have the people at the top of the food chain who are essentially benefiting from promoting a certain idea. They can exploit that division online, emotional content, rage, all the usual stuff. They can then make money from it. They can get brand deals. They can build a business around it. And it's the people who are effectively being impacted by, indoctrinated or radicalized when we're talking about kind of extreme negative ideologies, but just broadly are buying into what they're saying and then become the kind of the sort of shock troops, like the foot soldiers who are ready to sort of otherwise clip up this stuff and tell people what to believe and evangelize on their behalf. And that's, I guess, how all these systems work. Like the same with lots of the conspiracy theory communities I've investigated. And you kind of separate people out into these kind of true believers and then non-believers with a question mark, where you're like, I'm not sure how much you actually subscribe to what you're posting.
And it's kind of like a weird idea, because the manosphere is a very like direct version of that, where people like pay money to support the people at the top who they they admire this glamorous lifestyle and all the money, but the money comes from the people at the bottom. So it's a strange kind of like and it's quite a strange idea as well, where like the person, even when we're talking about the sort of loneliness influencers thing, there's a person there who's realized like this is a way to get attention and attract followers, and like I can potentially like get a brand deal out of this or whatever. And the person at the bottom is someone who's sitting in their house by themselves and being told, oh, this is normal, and in fact it's positive, and like don't read a book, just watch my Instagram, like don't go out to a bar and chat to people, like just like luxuriate into this lifestyle, but they're not really benefiting from it in the same way. So it's like a kind of strange little like world.
I think as well, when influencers build their entire brands around a particular idea, it becomes quite hard for them when their own circumstances change.
Yeah.
There's a story of an influencer who this happened in the past few weeks, where she's built an entire brand on basically like being a single woman in her 30s, and then she kind of secretly got married and then revealed it to her followers, and they were like, oh, and where do we go from here? And I think there's that feeling as well. And interestingly, because I was looking in the comments, and she'd had quite a lot of hate from people who felt betrayed in some way, because they were like, oh, hang on a second, you told me, you basically glamorized a certain lifestyle, and then you seem to have been doing something different behind the scenes, which is not to say, she shouldn't, as you say, do whatever she wants, but it's just hard when you become this persona to people, because there's a backlash you can also experience.
And I think it's a weird thing on social media where like we've all become so much more aware of each other's lives and lifestyles, and like it's fostered, this has always been part of human nature, I think, but it has fostered this culture of like comparison. And I think what a lot of influencers do is like they're almost giving people permission to live a certain kind of life. And so it's sort of a strange thing if you feel like you've been granted permission to live the way you're living by this figure, and then you find out it was all a lie. It's kind of like, it's like religion in a way. Like it's, it's like basically finding out that you've subscribed to this doctrine which is fundamentally underneath not true. Like I think that's really would be really, really destabilizing. And
It's
I
like
think
being
as well,
scammed. It's almost the same as how scams work. It's
yeah,
like, oh wait, what?
like what is this? And I think also like a lot of parasocial relationships, sometimes they are just totally one way, but a lot of parasocial relationships are kind of fostered by the influencer too, in terms of like they kind of like they foster this level of kind of like intrusion into their life, like, and they do, while they're what they're sharing is not necessarily their authentic life, they perform the idea that it is, and so that you're seeing behind the scenes and you're seeing like this truth and honesty. And I think there are like a lot of people that will not be at all cynical about that.
When you meet influencers, do you feel that kind of difference between what their content is like and then what they're like in person?
Yeah, I've met a lot of influencers over the
Sorry
years.
to any influencers among you.
And they're often quite like socially odd. They're they're it's the kind of person who wants to sort of spend a lot of their time making content of themselves, which, and also like all of their interactions happen with a huge delay. So like in a normal conversation, like if we're chatting and I say something and you're like, that's not really the way that they spend their days interacting with people. Like most of their interactions are like they make something, they plan it, it's really prescribed. They plan it, think about all the responses, they make a vlog or whatever, they think about all the responses, they try and then they put it out, and then they get the responses like with a big time delay. And they're often getting like super emotive responses. And then, so it's like their whole social world is really quite different to what we would think of as like a normal social world. So yeah, I mean, every time I've met them, they don't, as a general rule, like they're not good at making eye contact. They seem to find like one-on-one interactions quite hard. And if you actually think about where influencers start, a lot of the time it's like a teenager in their bedroom maybe finds socializing difficult, and then they start getting like they're posted, like they start making videos on YouTube, they start getting validation from that side. It's like it's not something people really like. Maybe that will change now because the internet's been around for, but it's not something people get into when they're like 28. It's something they get into when they're like 16, which is like, and then their whole life is like that.
And can shape the way that you then interact with the world, which is quite interesting. I've noticed actually recently quite a few people posting about influencer culture and talking about, for example, being on holiday and describing how they saw some influencers who essentially just like turned up at a hotel by a swimming pool for half an hour, filmed a load of content and then left. And this idea that you then say, oh, I had a brilliant time on holiday, but like you're at the swimming pool for about 15 minutes and then you're going to sit in a room and edit all of this content. I mean, it's like not authentic at all, but yet it's
what I've always noticed is like really short attention span. So it's like, I remember a couple of years ago I was staying at a hotel in Berlin, and just there was an influencer conference that was happening there, like totally unrelated to where I was staying, but I think I was the only non-influencer there. And in the lift I really noticed, or like around, people would come up and be like, oh my God, it's you, to each other because they're in the same world, but they would have like a 3-second conversation and then just like drift away and just completely, like it was like they'd been turned off, and they just were like, and then they just, their capacity to have like a longer, there was a really good piece I remember a couple of years ago with there were these hype houses starting. It was the start of COVID, I think, and it was these houses where like they were being funded, but it was like young influencers living in them. And I think
the content creator houses,
yes,
pandemic, yeah.
And there was a guy who went to stay with one of them, and he was like, they would start playing a basketball game, and then everyone would just like forget that they were playing and just wander off, like that kind of like inability to.
Sounds like playing The Sims.
Yeah, and just like, as you say, if something's not directly leading to content, then the purpose of, and I guess that relates to what we were saying about solo maxers, like that it's not really about developing your internal life as much as it is broadcasting your isolation, and those are two very different things. So it's like,
and a lot of time goes into making this content. I mean, it's hard to kind of and also some of this relates to how this content can be monetized and the ability to make money, and actually how precarious a job it can be to be an influencer, because you're essentially beholden to the algorithmic systems and to the platforms where you can then amass likes, views, make money. And so ultimately you've got to create so much content all the time in order to stay relevant, in order to kind of keep up with what's going on. And so it's almost so consuming. Like, I think how long it takes me if I'm like posting an Instagram with some captions, and like I like using I like investigating the bad bits on social media. I also like posting on social media, and it's really time consuming. And so it's like it's almost hard for people to live their actual lives because they're spending a lot of time posting about presenting their lives.
And I guess that's partly why, if somebody has a good strong brand as like a, you know, single woman in their 30s, and then they get a boyfriend, theoretically they could change avenue and like restyle themselves, but they're probably worried about their brand. You know, it's like I've got this brand doing this thing, and like, how would my followers react to that? So it's like they're kind of like bedded into whatever thing that they've managed to attract attention for.
I think that when we talk about particularly the femosphere and this concept of femcells, if we're then comparing that also to the manosphere, and even though they're obviously very different, for me, a lot of this seems to be a product of the algorithmic systems that I bang on about all the time, and the way that they entrench certain viewpoints and will direct people down these pathways where they find themselves at a much more extreme point than the one that they started at. And what's interesting is when I speak to lots of the insiders from the major social media companies, and you know, several engineers or people who've worked in trust and safety have spoken to me about the way that algorithms will decide what you're pushed based on usually the kind of set of interests that you've expressed through the content that you're watching and engaging with. But the platforms themselves, the social media companies, get so defensive if you say to them, well, hang on, you effectively are pushing people content based on their gender. They'll say, no, we don't push people content based on whether they're a woman or a man. But actually, there's a certain set of interests. Like, say, for example, you are really into World Cup content, GTA, F1, and you know that you could be a girl, but it's more likely than not that you might be a teenage boy or not a teenage boy, any boy, and so actually it's the algorithmic systems that are like very directly contributing to the creation of these online worlds that are like, this is my group, this is the group I'm a part of, and I am set up in opposition to this other group. And because you're inhabiting this very sort of in a very solitary way, actually, on your phone, scrolling on your feed, there's a certain normalization to it as well. You're like, oh, well, all the people here agree with me.
Yeah, your feed is like a very private thing. It's public, but it's also very private and distinct. And I think we all know anecdotally from the way that we all use social media that, like, I definitely think it's true that they algorithmically push content which is potentially more emotive. So like, I've even noticed that there's like one gym influencer who I like, because she always does like go get it like productivity content, and I just find her funny. So but since I started liking her content and engaging with her content, my whole feed is weight loss and gym and whatever. And I know that's just come from that one person, but it's basically like, if I think about how little I had to interact with that content for it to like take over my feed, I basically didn't have to interact with it at all. But they've obviously realized that that kind of content, I think, tends to trigger insecurities in people. And I think it's beneficial for these companies for you to be interacting with the product in an emotive way, because then you're spending more time going back to try and soothe the initial anxiety. But I think that one of the effects that can have, particularly for people who are very young, is that like sometimes they don't realize how extreme the stuff they say is sounding to people who do not agree. And I think that relates to the like manosphere and femosphere stuff, is like the way of talking which is normalized in those circles is not a normal way of talking. And some of the stuff that they're saying, like, not in the manosphere, I guess, but in the femosphere, some of the stuff they're saying is not necessarily wrong, but the way of expressing it is like so, dramatic and extreme. And I think within that sphere, it looks totally normal because that's the way everybody talks. Even the way people talk about like death and dying and killing themselves on social media, like it's a joke, but like, you know, people use that kind of language so like, or even the way people talk about laughter, where they're like, I died laughing, I killed myself. Like, there's like a really melodramatic way of speaking, which is totally normalized. But if you showed it to a person who'd never seen this before, they'd be like, what?
Which is because the algorithms reward that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Because it's like anything that evokes a reaction, provokes a reaction that makes you think, oh, makes you feel strongly, negatively or positively, you're going to engage with. And I think that's what's so interesting when I speak to particularly engineers who've worked at the social media companies, and you'll ask them about the kind of secret recipe behind the recommendation systems, which X have basically published their secret recipe, which is saying, like, arguments are good, rage is good, that gets you clicks and likes, good in terms of metrics and engagement. And it's the same across all of the social media platforms, that ultimately we know that emotional content thrives. But I think because the algorithms in some ways sort of take on a life of their own, that's how, like, I don't think that, for example, the guy who came up with this algorithm called the edge rank algorithm back when Facebook was Facebook, only Facebook, not Meta, the parent company, that was essentially one of the first examples of an algorithmic system that ranked our feed. And I think that when he came up with that, he couldn't have predicted that the manosphere would come to exist in the way it has, or that this kind of femosphere thing would exist, or trad wives. But actually, all of these things, to me, are a product of that system. And to bring it back to what you were saying, Rachel, about the kind of everything feels very extreme and intense and dramatized. I mean, that's the whole maxing thing, right? If we go back to solo maxing or cross wires maxing, as you guys are doing, or podcast maxing, or whatever we want it to be, London maxing. We've spoken about decline porn and other issues like that on Top Comment before. It's like maxing is a direct product of algorithms that basically reward optimization.
And freakishness, I think, is sort of rewarded because when you see so much content, anything that looks different is basically something that you're more likely to look at, I think. And so, like, even the whole looks maxer world, I think that
this
whole
clavicular, this influence who talks about basically sort of like breaking your jaw to improve your aesthetics.
And undergoing these like very extreme sort of self-administered beauty procedures like breaking bones and so on, like that kind of freakishness is a way of attracting attention, because it's like, it's sort of like just going to the gym and whatever, it's like everybody's doing that, and so you have to break your nose just to be a person of interest. It's kind of like the way the circus used to work, I suppose.
Yeah, and it's and the only way to be rewarded and to get those views and clicks and likes and to game the algorithm is to essentially do things in this hyper in this kind of hyper way, this extreme way. And I actually think, though, and I get loads of messages about this, a lot of people are really exhausted by that kind of content. Like, they actually don't enjoy this whole, like, oh, everything has to be, like, really over the top and extreme and too much. And I have several people who've messaged me saying, oh, I've actually come off this platform, or I've tried to reset my algorithm because I just really don't want that sort of content.
I remember a couple of years ago, I was doing a piece about, it was like an Instagram page that takes sort of a certain kind of TikToks, but there was a trend for people just covering their face in ketchup, and I was talking to like one of the like younger people about like why this was a trend, and he was like, oh, it's just the way to get to the top of the algorithm this week. And I was like, and there it is. Like, so much of this behavior is just like, oh, like just ketchup, because then that's the way to ascend the algorithm this week. So it's kind of like but yeah, what you're watching then is always like very insincere. And I think that's something that like sort of sits underneath all of this, is that like sometimes there's a strange kind of thing of like how sincere are the people at the top of the pyramid, or like this kind of lifestyle that they're selling in some cases might be totally distinct from the way when they live, might be actually impossible to live. Like the whole trad wife thing, it's like, it's, I think the ballerina farm thing is like, you know, her husband's from a very wealthy family and he kind of like funded the enterprise, and it's like, it's just not possible to start a farm and have it be that successful. It's like, it has all of this other stuff sitting underneath it, but that doesn't fit into the fantasy. And so, yeah.
And it feels like now there's a bit of a thirst for people being normal, like actually just being like, here I am going about my normal day, plating up my supper, here's my life. But the problem is almost that it feels like you have a limited shelf life of time that you can be an influencer who is normal, quote unquote, who's like posting normal stuff, because then you become an influencer and suddenly your life is not actually like a normal life, because you're showing, it's interesting.
Maybe this sounds old fashioned, but I don't believe that normal people should be famous. Like, I believe that people who are doing, like, it should be an exceptional category. Like, you should be like really good looking or a really talented actress or whatever. Like, I don't believe that this kind of banality should be sort of like so visible. I think that's quite a strange thing that's happened. And I'm not really sure like who that benefits.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, really, it benefits. If we think of social media companies as products, it benefits them to have a lot of people who are hyper engaged, feeling like they can realize a dream or a lifestyle or a way of being. Because ultimately, it's a bit like a lottery, right? It's like that feeling that you might post a video and this might be your video that goes really, really viral.
Yeah.
And then your life is changed overnight. And it can be changed. It's like you can have a profile, opportunities, money in a way that wasn't necessarily accessible before, but without actually any clear or transparency other than being very kind of extreme or eye-catching, that in order to realize that dream, it doesn't feel like there's it can happen at random to people. And often I've spoken to people who have gone sort of mistakenly viral and have often behaved in ways that they actually regret on social media. Maybe they got involved in sleuthing. We talk about the sleuth disease on Top Comment a fair bit. And they kind of say, oh, I didn't really expect to go viral, but then I was rewarded for it and it normalized it, and then kind of here I am. I wonder with for the social media platforms long term, whether this exhaustion from the maxing might mean that actually they do have to tweak and try and alter their algorithmic systems because actually people do turn off? Or will it be the case that maxing becomes so normal that actually it's almost normal maxing?
Zero maxing. Zero maxing becomes a new thing. I think there is I do think one of the big truths of social media is that people love to argue, and people like it's addictive because it gives an emotional response. Like that's part of any addiction, is based on a kind of like emotional absence and an emotional high that creates the absence that then you chase the high again. And so I think that kind of emotional response is like what keeps people like on social media all the time, like whether it's because it makes them feel inferior, jealous, insecure, angry. It's like that emotional profile is the thing that has to be kept high, I think, to make it interesting. Because we were talking earlier about why none of the extra placements have taken off, and it's like, I think it's because they're all liberal, and so nobody's arguing enough. And so it's like there's no emotional investment to be on the sort of like, why would you be there if it's not kind of, I don't think people just like talking. I think
and you don't get the algorithmic reward really for not arguing either.
Yeah, and there's no kind of like, but ultimately I don't actually think it's just an algorithmic.
No, it's actually a human thing.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of the reason that people sort of like find social media so addictive is because it taps into the underlying sort of like on the dopamine of doing a really good comment or winning an argument, or sort of like, I think that does like it really ignites something in people.
On that topic of people quitting X or not, we were chatting about Lisa Nandy, the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, who's decided, she tweeted yesterday, or X'd yesterday, posted on X saying, actually, I'm not going to be on here anymore because of the misinformation and hate. I don't want to be here. And it's been pretty divisive because some people are like, fair enough, if loads of government departments and the police and authorities weren't on X, then perhaps we wouldn't use it for news and politics in the way that we still do, even though the platform has changed very significantly since Elon Musk took over and sacked a lot of people and made changes to safety teams and just how the platform works, buying blue ticks, all that kind of thing. But then the counter argument from a lot of other people is like, hang on a second, you're in government, so if you feel like you can't fix this problem, then I think we're in a bit of trouble.
Yeah, I think it's not realistic. I agree. Like it's not realistic to say that, and because there hasn't been a successful replacement, like there hasn't been another platform which replicates the thing that Twitter used to do, where it was like extremely discursive and widespread discursive environment. It's like none of the others have really taken off in the same way, and so it's like, I just think it's not realistic to think that like if you're in the government you can just like opt out of the toxicity. It's like that's inbuilt into the system now, but all of the other stuff that goes with the system, like you need to kind of interact with that to get all of the other stuff too.
Now, in the spirit of non-rage-based conversations, we'd love to take some questions. So any questions that you have, please put your hand up and we will make sure a microphone comes to you. Ask us about any of the things we've been chatting about or anything else about your social media feed being in a pickle that you would like unpickling. Where's the mic? Can we go to this lady at the front and then also the guy behind her?
Oh, there's one with...
Or is there one there? Oh, perfect. You go first.
Hi, I'm Matthew. I wanted to touch on what you said about kind of influencers' brands being pulled out from underneath them. Like, for example, if they got a boyfriend. And there's been loads of investment from like the Middle East and Saudi Arabia and UAE and influencers going over there. And then now with the kind of Iran-US war, there's been a lot of posting about kind of like them actually feeling unsafe there. Do you have any thoughts about like suddenly influencers almost like having those brands in that like real world situation where this war is a real thing that's impacting so many people, and yet influencers are kind of like shilling Dubai chocolate and having a great time over there, and then suddenly being scared that bombs are flying a couple of days later?
We did an episode of Top Comment exactly about this because there was that really stark contrast between what we saw was happening in terms of the conflict in the Middle East, and then influencers posting this kind of quite idealistic version of Dubai or wherever else they were. And one of the things that was particularly interesting were allegations made about this legislation in Dubai that essentially you could get in really big trouble and or be arrested, and you had to have these influencer permits to be able to sort of operate in the country, and you could basically get in trouble if you said, actually, this is a bit scary and I don't like it very much. And I think what it reveals is how influencers have become a very effective tool actually for all kinds of different people, whether it's political groups and parties or whether it's governments, because they are this vessel that appears to present an authentic opinion or view, but actually often don't have to be necessarily entirely transparent about what they're saying and whether they believe it or why. And you see it even with wider influence operations, that it used to be the case that a network of bot accounts was sort of enough. Now it seems more effective to actually support or pay or even just kind of feed and influence certain ideas and encourage them to express those, because it creates this feeling of kind of grassroots support that's very hard for journalists to investigate, because you're reliant on an influencer being like, yeah, some random person from Russia messaged me actually saying, would you like to post about this, which they usually wouldn't do. I don't know what you think, Rachel, about the whole Dubai situation and what it tells us about influence.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, because I feel that like a lot of influencers, this type of influencer who was in Dubai, their whole pitch about themselves is that they're sort of apolitical and they just have nothing to do with politics, and they sort of also, I think, sometimes like play dumb, where they're like, well, I'm just like posting my bum on holiday and like, why should I know about politics? And then it's sort of like, I guess it like exposed the fallacy of that, because it's a very specific way of life in Dubai that they obviously knew what it was like because they were living there. And yeah, I think it was kind of interesting as well. Like, I guess some of the ones that I saw, like, they instantly sort of jumped to this thing of being like, I had no idea that this was going to possibly happen. Like, this in Dubai, who knew? And it was like, you did. It was a possibility. And that kind of like, yeah, I guess that's sort of like
faux naivety almost.
Yeah, the sort of like
maybe it is naivety.
Willful naivety. I think most of them are probably much smarter than they sort of perform. Like, it's not, I don't think it's a very advantageous brand to be like, I'm really cynical and whatever. That's like not what they would perform. But yeah, I think it exposed the level of sort of like performance, I guess, that I think, yeah, some of the audience is probably quite naive to before.
Thank you so much. Other questions? Could we go to either of the women at the front, and then hopefully we'll get to everyone.
Hiya, I'm Millie, and I've recently sort of been doing a bit of research into the sort of clipping economy and how that's tied to the manosphere. And I was wondering what you think about how much control people like Clavicular and Andrew Tate actually have over their brand once sort of this clipping economy is sort of taken over and pushing all this attention-grabbing short-form content. It takes their comments out of context. And I was just, wondering how much control these people really have over their brand when they get so large.
I have lots of thoughts about this. Clavicular, I don't know if you've actually watched his stream, but like, it's the most boring thing you would ever watch. It's just so boring, like basically 99.999% of the time, and then the idea is like 0.1% of the time something happens that's worth clipping. And he's very young, and I don't think anybody who's that age knows what they're getting themselves in for. His life has been so weird. It's like he literally just sits all day filming himself being extremely boring, and then in the hope that something manages to sort of like spark and pop out of it. And I think he has sort of no control over that at all. And I think also like it drives extreme behavior on his end, obviously to try and like do something that might seem entertaining. But ultimately, like he can't really control the way that like will that get picked up? Will it go viral? It's like it's almost like quite a precarious existence. So I think in a way, like while like not Andrew Tate, I wouldn't put him in the same category, but while someone like Clavicular like has a lot of influence in one way, he's sort of a bit of a prisoner of his like sort of enterprise in another. It's a really, really strange existence.
Yeah, I think that clipping is so interesting because, so if anyone who's not heard of it before, it's basically just people watching a stream or content from a user and then just taking clips and essentially putting them out everywhere. And it's one of the reasons why Andrew Tate became such a big deal, because he had this army of people who would clip stuff up. And actually, in order to be effective when it comes to clipping, you've got to have this very devoted army of followers.
Yeah.
And I see it with some of the conspiracy theory influencers. The sort of health misinformation space is similar. And again, it gives this kind of guise of authenticity, because it's like, great, people who are fans of or support this person are putting the clips out. So it's not from them. So therefore, it must be a viewpoint that you could agree with. But exactly like you say, you don't actually have huge amounts of control over it. And I think one thing that's been really interesting has been looking at how political figures sort of try to use clipping as well. I mean, Donald Trump and US politics more generally I feel have tried to sort of dip their toe in the clipping space, but then actually and relying on these kind of big fandoms, whether it's MAGA or, you know, you've seen people like Gavin Newsom to some extent try and do it as well on the left. And it's interesting that actually, like with politicians, it's a really dangerous game, because loads of stuff can get clipped up that you absolutely did not want to go viral or intend to go viral at all. And you just don't really have that control. And I think that the link between clipping and streaming is so interesting, because it feels like that's now the kind of new way of, I'm going to do this really boring stream for hours and hours and hours and see where we
happens.
go. Yeah, exactly. And you kind of wonder what the next version of clipping will be, and how it will manifest. And people know that they can themselves grow huge followings by clipping stuff up in that way.
And the internet has always had this weird not the internet, sorry, social media has always had this weird context collapse sort of quality to it, where like old tweets get resurfaced and clips, and like it's this one sort of piece of information that's separated from everything else that's linked to that piece of information. And it's basically just where misinformation comes from, because you're encouraged and like almost forced to just see it on its own terms without anything else attached to it. And I think that's been quite strange for like people's brains having to like view that. And I kind of think like in the sort of height of the cancel culture era, there was a lot of like dragging up old tweets and so on. And I often find it strange that someone's tweets from when they were like a 16-year-old were taken to be, but I actually think it's because the platform is flat and you would see it in the same way that you see present tense information. It felt like it was happening like right now, like it felt like it wasn't that long ago. And I think the same is true of the clipping thing. It's like you're seeing stuff and it feels like really immediate. It feels like it's evidence because it's a video and they said this on the video, but it's like you didn't see anything that happened around it. It's kind of like it's encouraging people to like, I guess, see stuff as factual when it's not necessarily factual.
Could we get this question at the front, and then hopefully I might try and take a couple at once, because then we'll try and be speedy, because we've not got that long.
Hi, my name's Katie. I was just wanting to know, really, if it's possible to cleanse your algorithm. As a woman who recently turned 50 and, as Rachel said, maybe interacted with a post about health or wellness, I am now completely bombarded with ways to make myself more beautiful and more perfect, and to cure all my ailments with all sorts of different pills and injections and blood tests. And is there any way of stopping it?
That is a very good question. And
I've been watching lots of cat videos to try and
yeah, that is like tip number one. This is probably the question I get asked the most of any question. Tip number one is to actually just deliberately seek out other types of content that you really like and find funny, and try and engage more so with those. There are certain ways that you can game your algorithm, not just watching stuff, but like sending it to someone as well. So if someone, like a friend, likes similar stuff to you, it's quite good to share stuff with them, because then that will again indicate to your algorithmic systems that, I want more of that sort of thing. They do have inbuilt tools on the platforms where you can be like, I'm not interested in this, I don't want this. They can be pretty ineffective. I mean, I've spoken to loads of users who are like, yeah, I'll say I don't want this, and then for a day I don't get it, and then I get it again, and it's really annoying. I think even just the fact that you realise what's happening to you is sort of like first step. I think as well that actually deliberately seeking out like counterpoints to the specific content that you don't like, you know, things that are the opposite of sort of health content is quite good as well, because then your algorithm gets a bit confused and it's like, oh, you kind of want to like eat 10 McDonald's and also like go to the gym. What's going on? So I think all of that stuff's useful. And then also if you're just seeing this kind of content, just being aware of the impact of it. You can also set up an entirely new account. The difficulty with that often is that it will be interconnected with your other accounts, and you find that actually content from all of the platforms are feeding into one another. It's that thing of when people feel like, is your phone listening to you? Because it's so weird that it knew that I just talked about that. And usually it's actually because you will have like Googled something, or you will have messaged someone something, and you realize that even though people aren't necessarily reading your messages, they are ultimately using that data to program your algorithm. So all of the, just being aware of all of those things, I think is probably tip number one.
I think saving other stuff, you know, where you can click on Instagram, you can click save. I think saving stuff is also helps to prioritize it. So like clicking save on cat videos helps to like demonstrate your interest.
At one point we thought of calling this podcast Bring Back Cat Videos. As big cat fans. We've got time for one more question. I'm so sorry, I did not tell the truth when I said we'll have time for all the questions. That one at the back. Thank you.
A lot of the time when I come across this sort of content, it tends to be through the lens of like mockery and bullying. Like Clavicular, I first came across when he was interviewed by Adam Friedland, and he was sort of bullied and run rings around. And how much of these sort of scenes do you think are driven by that irony and mocking compared to actual genuine interest in what the content is?
I think that's a really good question, because actually I think, you know, if we're going down this route of algorithms run off emotions, obviously also people taking the mick or not liking it but nonetheless being drawn to it make up a huge portion of that user base often. Like lots of people will be seeing stuff that they actively don't like but nonetheless are kind of drawn to and continue watching. I think the issue with that is that obviously it doesn't mean that everybody watching, exactly like you say, everyone watching Clavicular or any of these influencers we're talking about necessarily subscribe to their worldview or even are impacted by it. I think the impact is much more, I think the corrosive impact actually is in the cumulative effect of that, which is because more people are viewing that content, that influencer or person or their content becomes more prominent in a way that's actually disproportionate perhaps to how much people actually like that content or care about it. And then it starts to shape and influence our wider sort of political and societal discourse. I think the media are complicit in that as well. Often they'll cover things because it's getting traction. That doesn't necessarily mean that people actually like it. And I think a lot of this is about covering what's popping up on social media feeds in a way that is responsible. So yeah, I think that you're right that actually probably quite a significant proportion of people watching this stuff don't necessarily buy into it or subscribe to it, but it's the normalization thing. It's like we take our cues from, like if you see a video's had 10 million views, you don't know how many of those 10 million are people who like it or not. And so you might think, oh, does everyone else think this is normal? It's like when you run to the comments and you're like, oh, what? Oh, I didn't think that about this, but now everyone else seems to think.
And you always have to remember with the comments is like most people don't comment on stuff, so the people who do is a specific type of person who like is the type to do that. But I also think with a lot of this stuff, like we do all have to remember as adults that a lot of the people who are seeing this are very young and like much more impressionable, and their critical thinking skills are a lot lower. So like even if we're sort of looking at it with like a kind of critical lens or making fun of it or whatever, it's not the way that it necessarily is being seen.
And they're making sense of the world. So it's like you get your cues from the people around you, and if your cues are the social media world, then that will be distorting your sense of what's sort of okay and not okay, I guess. Mm-hmm. Okay, we've run out of time, but any other questions, please do come and chat to us at the end, or send me a DM or Rachel a DM. You can also get in touch with top comment at bbc.co.uk, or the WhatsApp number, which I don't know by heart, which is... Oh, my producer's saying it in my ear and I'm never going to be able to do that. +44 330 123 9480. Thank you so much for top comment maxing with us. We have loved chatting to you. And do go listen to the podcast, which is on BBC Sounds or wherever you get your podcasts.